I was so tired, bone achingly weary, heart sick, footsore, empty, and totally tired. Did I tell you I was tired? Oh, I'd barely slept, dozing until dawn. And when I was awoken by Magda fussing with a pungent package, oh, the sickly smell of spices provoked an unpleasant pulsing behind my right eye. An unwelcome aura, lurked on the edge of my vision. "Miriam!" hissed Magda. "Come on! We've got to go!" It made sense to Magda to drag me along, but I didn't want to return there, to be honest. There didn't seem to be much point, and as Clay pointed out later, we were taking a huge risk. But Magda was determined, and after all the chaos and confusion of Friday evening, she wasn't sure she could find her way back to the garden by herself. And she needed to go. She just had to go. For some reason, I always fell in with whatever Magda wanted. So, obediently, I hauled my hammering head out of the pillow and felt for my sandals. Several surreal hours later, with my migraine slowly subsiding, Clay said that he wanted us to cut our losses and head for home. And I didn't need to be persuaded. I was desperate to escape, to exchange the city's stinking streets for the open road, to fill my lungs with fresh air, to get away from the clamour of the crowds, to clear my head after the horror and confusion of the previous few days. The Romans had carved a road through the ravine to Emmaus. Soon we were walking in welcome shade, the soft sound of our steps the only noise. The fresh air was balm to my aching head, the bird song soothing to my shattered soul. It had been hell. There is no other word to describe it, and I do not use that word lightly. Never in my life did I expect that I would ever be present at any form of execution. But I was there. We were there, standing amidst the roar of that malicious mob. Oh, the cries of anguish, the stench of blood and sweat. Magda and I supporting his mother, weeping agonised tears, hoping against hope for a final miracle, praying for death to come quickly when we realised that that miracle was not to be. You know, and as I watched him die, something in me died as well. The hope of God's kingdom, that dream of revolution that we'd shared, that vision of renewal. Like the other men, Cleopas had stayed away from Golgotha, hiding from the authorities. "It's too risky," they said, "but no one will bother with a group of wailing women." Just a group of wailing women. Despite spending 3 years following the Master, there was now this hint of condescension and even contempt in the men's voices. But we had followed the Master just as faithfully, caring, serving, providing, learning alongside them too. Because Jesus was one of the few men, and certainly the only rabbi whom I have ever met, who treated women with respect. Somebody who spoke to me like I actually mattered. But now, well, after what has happened on Friday, Clay seemed to have closed his eyes and closed his heart. Meanwhile, well, my vision was muddled, fragmented. My heart, it was just ripped open, exposed, and anguish weighed me down, sitting within me like a lump of indigestible, unleavened bread. I had tried so hard to be strong, but now overwhelmed by the horror of it all and blinkered with grief, all I could do was focus on my feet as they limped along the road. One step in front of the other. Keep going, Miri, keep going. I didn't particularly want to talk, but Clay started to badger me. He wanted to know what had happened on my early morning escapade with Magda. I was in no mood to go through it all over again. My befuddled head had had enough. It's hard to know when that man first fell in step with us. He trod lightly, keeping pace with us, saying nothing initially, just listening to Clay. But then, "Tell me," he said, "what are you talking about? Such an intense discussion." I wanted to walk on, but Cleopas stopped, asking, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been going on over the past few days?" "What has been going on?" he asked. "Everything that's happened to Jesus of Nazareth," Clay answered. "This man was a prophet, and he was considered by God and all the people to be powerful in everything he did and said. And we were convinced that he was going to be the one who would deliver Israel, that God's kingdom was coming through him. Then our high priest and our leaders betrayed him. They had him sentenced to death and they crucified him." And that was Friday. But a couple of our women have confused us because early this morning they were at the tomb and they couldn't find his body. And they came back with some story that they had seen angels and that he was alive. I tried to interrupt Clay at this point. "What do you mean, some story?" "Miri," he said, "you were exhausted, you were upset, you had a migraine, you couldn't even see straight." But Magda said, "Oh, come on, Miri." She was hysterical, and she's hardly the most reliable of women, is she? At this point, Cleopas turned back to the stranger. "Magda has a few problems, you see. She used to be I said, "Clay, what has that got to do with anything?" I was livid. "I'm just saying, Miriam, that she's not what most men might call the most reliable witness." The stranger cleared his throat politely. Somehow, he seemed silently supportive. Placing a patronising hand on my arm, Clay continued. "But something has definitely happened, something odd, because our men went and checked it out properly. They went to the tomb, and it was empty just as the women had said. They didn't see Jesus." I was furious. I shook Clay's hand off my arm and I walked away. Clay followed a few steps behind. our new companion alongside him. There was a pause, and then the stranger spoke. "How foolish you are! How slow you are! Why don't you simply believe all that the prophets said? Don't you see that these things had to happen, that the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter his glory? And then, starting at the beginning with the books of Moses, he taught Clay through all the prophets, opening up the scriptures in a whole new way. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with deepest grief. He carried our weaknesses. Our sorrows weighed him down, and we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins." Now my head was in a mess, but my heart was strangely comforted by the stranger's words. "They have pierced my hands and my feet. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. It just hurt so much to remember. I didn't really want to think about it. They will mourn for him whom they have pierced, mourn for him as for an only son." And slowly, the stranger's scattered words settled as small seeds of hope in the rutted runnels of my faith. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. He was buried like a criminal in a rich man's grave. Did Magda and I really see it? Did we? At that rich man's grave, could it really be? I just wanted to go home. And so we reached the crossroads. It was time to turn off for Emmaus. The stranger's soliloquy stopped. Drawing his cloak around him, he bade us farewell. Clay pressed the stranger to come and eat with us. It will be plain fare, but Miri makes the best bread. What did I have in? Oil, dried fish. I'd ground the flour before I left for Jerusalem. It would be enough. I could use yeast to leaven my loaf. Unleavened bread could be so hard to swallow. It would be good to see the loaves rising. Just a little yeast for 3 measures of flour. It permeates every part of the dough. Oh, I could still hear Jesus saying those words, explaining how his kingdom was going to start small but grow much larger, like yeast working in secret. There would be an uprising, there would be transformation. That was his promise. That was our hope. But where is that hope now? For me, bread making has always been a satisfying experience. I love the yeasty smell, the way everything miraculously comes together in the mix. Working that bread mixture that afternoon was therapeutic. I poured all my emotion into that dough, kneading it with my knuckles. I also imagined pounding some sense into my husband's head. But from what I could hear in the next room, our guest was doing a better job of it. The old covenant is being fulfilled and renewed, replaced with a better one. based on promises of better things. Remember the prophet's words. I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. I will put my laws into their minds. I will write them on their hearts. They will be my people and I will be their God. Something strange happened as I made my bread that afternoon. The dough came together smoothly and rose in miraculous time. And as it baked, our new companion continued to speak with authority and grace. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it never is more than 1 grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over, a plentiful harvest of new life. I looked down at my dusty hands. When I had milled that flour before we went up to Jerusalem for Passover, I had knelt at the grinding stones, rhythmically crushing the wheat, never considering the potential for new life in every single kernel. The lamps were lit, the table laid. Clay invited our companion to bless the bread. And as he lifted the loaf and broke the crust, he looked straight into my eyes and said, Miri, Cleopas, my dear friends, I was broken for you. My body has been given for you. And whenever you break bread together, I want you to remember me. And in that moment, my vision was restored. This was no stranger, not even a guest. This was the dearest one of all, our host, utterly transformed and yet wonderfully familiar. A true companion, sharing bread at our table, sitting alongside Clay and I in our grief and confusion. But before we could hold on to him, he was gone.